Göring reads the report twice. Then he laughs. Every name in this story is real. Every number, every factory, every convoy, pulled from the official record. What follows is not legend. It's what actually happened, told the way it happened. May 1940. Berlin. On his desk sits an intelligence memo, a translation of a speech by the American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. 50,000 aircraft a year, the memo says. That is the number Roosevelt has promised his country. 50,000. Göring closes the folder. To him, the number is not a threat. It is a joke. America, he tells his officers, builds refrigerators. It builds automobiles for housewives and traveling salesmen. It does not build weapons of war, not real ones, not fast enough to matter, not disciplined enough to matter. The German war machine has spent a decade preparing for this moment. America has spent that same decade selling cars on credit. He signs off on the report with a note of dismissal. 4 years later, that same man will sit in an Allied interrogation room, reading a different set of numbers. Numbers he cannot argue with. Numbers that will tell him a single American factory floor, one building, under one roof, is capable of rolling a finished heavy bomber off its line every 63 minutes, day and night. Without stopping, he will have no laugh left for that one. This is the story of how that happened. How a country Göring mocked as too soft, too commercial, too undisciplined for war, turned its factories, its highways, and its ordinary people into a machine the Axis never found a way to stop. Not a story about a single battle, a story about a number the German High Command could never make add up in time, and about the moment their own soldiers realized it, standing in an American camp, staring at a piece of fruit someone had thrown away. To understand how it happened, you have to go back to a man almost nobody outside Detroit had heard of. William Knudsen was not born American. He came to the United States from Denmark as a young man with almost nothing and worked his way up through the auto industry until he became president of General Motors, one of the most powerful men in American manufacturing. By the late 1930s, he was drawing a salary of over $300,000 a year, an extraordinary sum in an era when most families lived on a few thousand. Then Roosevelt called. By December of 1941, the choice had already been made for him. The attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States into a war it had spent 2 years watching from a distance, and overnight, distance stopped being an option. Roosevelt went on the radio and told the country plainly what would be required of it. The nation would become, in his words, the arsenal of democracy. It was not a metaphor. It was an instruction. Knudsen walked away from that salary. He took a new job, one that paid him $1 a year, and became the man tasked with turning American industry into an arsenal before the war reached American shores. Officially, his title barely captured what he was actually being asked to do: take an economy built for consumer goods and remake it, almost overnight, into the largest weapons-producing machine on Earth. The scale of the task was staggering. American industry did not know how to build combat aircraft at scale. There were no factories designed for it, no supply chains built around it, no trained workforce waiting to be deployed. What existed instead was something else entirely: the assembly line know-how of the automobile industry. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, companies that had spent decades perfecting the science of building complex machines fast, cheap, and identical, one after another, on a moving line. Knudsen's answer was simple and audacious. Take that same machinery of mass production and point it at bombers instead of Buicks. In Michigan, a new plant rose out of farmland outside Detroit, a facility built for one purpose: producing the B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber, at a scale no aircraft plant had ever attempted. It was called Willow Run. Nobody knew yet if it would work. It did not work at first. The early months were a disaster. Aircraft parts built to automotive tolerances did not fit together the way automobile parts did. A car door with a small gap is a car door. A bomber wing with a small gap is a bomber that doesn't fly. Skilled labor was scarce. Most experienced machinists were already committed elsewhere or in uniform. Quality control failures piled up, week after week. The press mocked the project mercilessly, twisting its name into a bitter joke. Will it run? For a while, it looked like they were right to ask. But engineers kept adjusting. Foremen kept retraining. The line kept moving, even through failure, because there was nowhere else for the war effort to go but forward. And by 1944, something had changed. The kinks had been solved. The workforce had been retrained, expanded, reorganized around the brutal logic of repetition. Willow Run's final assembly line stretched over a mile, a single continuous corridor of aircraft in every stage of construction, moving forward in a slow, relentless procession, like a river that never stopped flowing. At its peak, that one line was producing a finished B-24 bomber roughly once every hour. It wasn't the only miracle happening on American soil. On the West Coast, shipbuilder Henry Kaiser was running a parallel transformation in the shipyards, cutting the construction time of a Liberty ship, a full ocean-going cargo vessel, from what had once taken months down to a matter of days, using the same principle driving Willow Run. Break the impossible task into small, repeatable steps and let ordinary workers, trained fast, execute them in parallel. At Willow Run's sister plants, Republic Aviation was turning out P-47 Thunderbolts by the thousands, fighters that would soon be clearing German skies of the aircraft Göring had once boasted would never be matched. Meanwhile, deep inside the Reich, Germany was building its own aircraft in tunnels, in hollowed-out mountainsides, in underground facilities designed to hide production from Allied bombers, using forced and slave labor, prisoners who had every reason in the world to want the machines they were building to fail. Sabotage was not rare. In places, it was routine. A German engineer could design the finest aircraft in the world on paper. He could not force a starving, unwilling workforce to build it well. Two systems, two philosophies of production, one built on coercion, hidden underground, running on fear. The other built in the open, in daylight, running on a workforce that, for the first time in many of their lives, believed the work actually mattered. Because it wasn't just former auto executives filling those factories, it was women. With so many men now in uniform, American industry turned, out of necessity, to a labor force it had never fully trusted before. Women stepped onto assembly lines that had been closed to them just years earlier. Welding, riveting, wiring, inspecting components no one had ever taught them to build, because a year earlier, no one had imagined they would need to. The culture nicknamed them Rosie the Riveter. But behind the nickname was a real, measurable shift in what American industry could produce. Factories that adapted their training and their production methods around this new workforce saw output climb by as much as 300%. Behind the statistic were individual stories that never made it into any German intelligence report. Women who had spent their lives being told a factory floor was no place for them, learning in a matter of weeks to read blueprints, operate riveting guns, inspect airframes for the kind of tiny structural flaw that could kill a bomber crew over Germany. Some had husbands or brothers already flying the very aircraft they were building. For them, the tolerance on a rivet wasn't an abstraction. It was personal, in a way no wage or nickname could capture. Nobody in Berlin had planned for that variable. Göring's mistake in 1940 wasn't just underestimating American factories. It was underestimating who America was willing to let build its weapons. And Willow Run was only one front in a much larger transformation. In Detroit itself, the Ford Motor Company's massive River Rouge complex, once the beating heart of American car culture, retooled its lines for tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines. Down the road, Chrysler built an entirely new facility, the Detroit Arsenal, for one purpose only: tanks. Before the war, Chrysler had never built a tank in its history. Within a few short years, that same arsenal was turning out Sherman tanks by the thousands, at a pace that startled even the engineers who designed it. The country that Göring had mocked as a nation of car salesmen had simply pointed the car salesmen's factories at the war instead, and discovered that an assembly line built to churn out 1 million identical automobiles a year could just as easily churn out tanks, engines, and fuselages, once someone gave the order. By the summer of 1944, the machine Knudsen had built was no longer a question sitting on a memo somewhere in Washington. It was a fact on the ground, rolling across Western Europe on rubber tires at a pace no German staff officer had modeled for. After the D-Day landings in June, Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began pushing east, faster than almost anyone had predicted, Allied command included. At the front of that advance was General George S. Patton, driving his armored columns toward Germany with a speed that unnerved his own commanders nearly as much as it did the enemy. German staff officers studied the map and did the math. General Alfred Jodl, one of the senior planners of the Wehrmacht, looked at the growing distance between the Normandy beaches and the front line and reached a conclusion any military textbook of the era would have supported. No army could sustain offensive operations across supply lines stretching more than roughly 600 kilometers, not without pausing, not without slowing down to rebuild its logistics. It was sound doctrine. It had held true for 100 years of warfare. It was wrong. The reason it was wrong had a name: the Red Ball Express. It began as an emergency measure, a truck convoy system built almost overnight to solve one brutal problem. The railways in newly liberated France were shattered, bombed out by the Allies themselves during the invasion, specifically to cut off German reinforcements. There was no functioning rail network left to move supplies forward, so the Allies built a highway instead. Not a physical one, a procedural one. A one-way loop of roads reserved exclusively for supply convoys, running from the beachhead depots all the way toward the front, with military police stationed along its length to keep everything else off it. Almost 6,000 trucks ran that route, and the men driving the overwhelming majority of them, by most accounts, around 75%, were black soldiers serving in an army that was still officially segregated, assigned overwhelmingly to support and logistics roles rather than combat. Quartermaster units that had spent the war so far doing unglamorous, unheralded work suddenly found themselves running the single most important operation, keeping Patton's advance alive. Men who the Army's own institutional racism had pushed to the margins of the war effort were now, quite literally, the reason the front line could keep moving at all. The trucks ran 20 hours a day. They ran with headlights on, at night, in direct defiance of standard wartime blackout doctrine, because speed mattered more than concealment, and because stopping to hide meant stopping the war. Convoys moved with vehicles spaced as little as 30 seconds apart, an interval that would have been considered reckless under any peacetime standard. Breakdown, ambush, landmine. The drivers pushed through all of it, hour after hour, because behind them sat a system built to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. At its peak, the Red Ball Express delivered somewhere around 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. Picture what that actually looked like from inside one truck cab. A driver, awake since before dawn, gripping a wheel that never really stops vibrating. Dust and diesel fumes thick enough to taste. The convoy ahead just a pair of dim taillights in the dark, 30 seconds away, always 30 seconds away, because falling further behind meant losing the line entirely. No time to stop for a downed tree or cratered road. Routes were rerouted on the move, radioed ahead, absorbed into the flow without ever slowing it down. Sleep came in fragments, snatched at supply depots between loading and unloading, before the next run began. This was not a single dramatic night. It was hundreds of nights, repeated by thousands of drivers, for months without pause. German reconnaissance watched it happen and could not make sense of what they were seeing. This was not how logistics were supposed to work. The Wehrmacht, even in 1944, still depended on horse-drawn transport for a staggering share of its own supply movement. Historians estimate as much as 80% of German army transport still relied on horses, not trucks. To German officers trained in a doctrine built around limited, precious, mechanized transport, the sight of an endless river of American trucks running around the clock, accepting losses as a routine cost of doing business, wasn't just impressive. It was incomprehensible. Jodl had calculated the war using the only kind of math he had ever known. He hadn't accounted for a country that could simply build more trucks than it could lose. Even after the trucks proved unstoppable, the German command found one more reason to hope: fuel. An armored advance the size of Patton's needed staggering quantities of gasoline, and every mile it pushed forward stretched its fuel lines thinner. German officers, including General Heinrich von Luttwitz, reasoned that this, finally, was the flaw in the American machine. Mechanization was a strength on open roads, but mechanization needed fuel, and fuel could run out, the way it always had for every mechanized army in history. What they hadn't accounted for was Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. Allied engineers had built undersea fuel pipelines beneath the English Channel, feeding gasoline directly from Britain into the liberated ports of France, bypassing the vulnerability of tanker convoys almost entirely. Another problem German planners assumed was fixed. Another problem that quietly wasn't. It showed on the front line, too. In late July of 1944, American forces launched Operation Cobra, a breakout offensive designed to finally punch through the German lines, pinning the Allies inside Normandy. It worked faster than anyone in Allied command had projected. Patton's armor didn't just break through. It kept going, mile after mile, in a way German defensive doctrine had no real answer for, because German defensive doctrine had never had to plan for an opponent who could resupply in advance of that speed for that long. Every kilometer Patton gained should have been a kilometer closer to his own logistical collapse. Instead, the trucks kept arriving. But the moment that truly broke something inside the German officer corps didn't come from a battlefield report. It didn't come from a captured supply depot, or a downed reconnaissance photo, or a general's memo. It came from something smaller, something almost embarrassing in how ordinary it was. It came from watching Americans throw things away. German prisoners of war, many of them from elite, once feared units like the Africa Corps. Men who had survived years of rationing, of scavenging, of stretching every liter of fuel and every gram of food as far as it could possibly go, were transported to processing camps and holding facilities behind Allied lines. And what they saw there did something months of combat had never managed to do. It broke their belief in the war they were fighting. These were not raw recruits. Many had fought across North Africa under Rommel, men who had earned a grudging respect, even from their enemies, for their discipline and their endurance under brutal desert conditions. They had survived on rationed water, rationed fuel, rationed everything, for years. If anyone understood how to measure an army's strength by what it lacked, it was them. And now they stood behind a fence, watching a country that didn't seem to understand scarcity at all. They watched American servicemen bite into an apple, decide they didn't like it, and throw the rest away. They watched tires pulled off vehicles and discarded over cosmetic defects that would have been repaired, reused, and rationed for years back home in Germany. They saw electric lighting running through the night without a single thought given to scarcity. They were given ice cream. They were given Coca-Cola. The small, absurd luxuries of a country that had never once had to fight a war on its own soil. To men whose own country was rationing coffee down to a trickle, whose own families were tightening belts that had already been tightened past comfort years earlier, the sight of American abundance, casual, careless, almost unconscious abundance, did not read as luxury. It read as the arithmetic of a war already lost. One German prisoner, reflecting later on that shock, put it in words that have circulated in post-war accounts of these encounters ever since. A line that captures, more than any statistic could, exactly what broke inside these soldiers the moment they saw it. "We prepared for your tanks," he said. "We prepared for your planes and your ships. We never prepared for your trucks. Not the weapons, the logistics, the sheer, relentless capacity to produce, to supply, to waste, and still win." Word of that shock didn't stay contained behind the wire of a single POW camp. It traveled through letters censors sometimes let slip through soldiers later repatriated, through the simple, unstoppable fact that hundreds of thousands of German prisoners passed through American hands over the course of the war and carried what they'd seen with them. An army's morale is built on more than orders from the top. It's built on what the men in the field believe about the enemy they're facing. And by late 1944, a growing number of German soldiers, not all of them, but enough to matter, no longer believed they were fighting a war they could win, not because they'd lost a battle, because they'd seen a warehouse. By the time the war in Europe ended, The numbers told a story the German High Command had refused to believe back in 1940. America had not simply matched German industrial output, it had buried it. By the war's end, the United States had outproduced every other major combatant nation on Earth, Allied and Axis alike, across almost every category that mattered. Aircraft, ships, tanks, trucks. Historians who have studied the wartime economies of the period have noted something almost hard to believe. American war production alone came to rival, and by some measures exceed, the combined output of Germany, Japan, and Italy put together. Not because American engineering was necessarily superior on paper, because American industry could turn a blueprint into a finished machine at scale faster than anyone thought possible, and then do it again the next hour. And the hour after that. Factories that had never built a single military aircraft before the war were, within a few years, producing bombers faster than the enemy could shoot them down. A logistics system improvised almost overnight was outrunning doctrine that had taken 100 years to develop. A country Berlin had dismissed as soft, had outarmed, outsupplied, and outlasted a war machine that had spent a decade preparing for exactly this fight. Hermann Göring, the man who once laughed off Roosevelt's promise of 50,000 aircraft a year, would eventually face those numbers directly, first as a prisoner, later as a defendant standing trial for his role in a war his own intelligence services had catastrophically misjudged from the very beginning. The nation he'd dismissed as too soft for war had done exactly what he told his officers it never could. It wasn't won only in the mud of the front line. It was won in Willow Run, on an assembly line over a mile long, by workers who'd never built an aircraft before the war began. It was won on a stretch of French highway, where trucks ran 20 hours a day with their headlights blazing into the dark, driven by men their own country still refused to treat as equals. It was won by women who had never touched a factory floor before 1941, and who reshaped what a wartime workforce could look like in the space of a few short years. And in a strange, quiet way, it was won in the smallest moment of all. A half-eaten apple, tossed aside without a second thought, watched by a prisoner of war who understood in that instant exactly what his country was up against. Some of the men who ran that machine never got the recognition history owed them. The Red Ball Express drivers went home to an army and a country that was still years away from treating them as equals. Even after they'd spent months keeping an entire front alive with nothing but a truck, a road, and the will to keep driving. The women who reshaped what a wartime factory could look like were, in many cases, quietly pushed back out of those same factories the moment the war ended and the men came home. History has a habit of remembering the generals first, and the people who made the generals' plans possible only much later, if at all. The German High Command spent the war looking for America's weakness. They never found one, because the thing that beat them wasn't a weapon at all. It was a system, built by ordinary people who had never seen a bomber before Pearl Harbor, and who built, out of Detroit, out of highways, out of sheer industrial will, an arsenal the other side could never fully bring themselves to believe was real, even as it rolled past them, 20 hours a day, headlights burning through the dark. Some wars are decided by generals. This one was decided by a factory floor, a highway, and a country that simply refused to stop building. Some stories cross oceans the way convoys once did. If you're watching tonight, drop a comment and tell us what part of the world this story reached you from.